The North Sea does not forgive. It never has. Along the low, flat coastline of the medieval Dutch lowlands, the sea was not a distant thing, not a view from a cliff top or a subject for poetry. It was a neighbour, a dangerous one. It pressed against the dikes with the patience of something that had existed long before human hands shaped the land, and it would exist long after. The people who lived in its shadow understood this in the way that only people who have lost someone to water truly understand it. Not as philosophy, but as fact, as the particular silence that follows a drowning, as the way a fisherman's wife learns to read the sky before her husband leaves each morning. The town of Edam sat on the edge of the Zuiderzee in the early 1500s, a prosperous, practical place of merchants and fishermen and dike keepers, people who built their lives on reclaimed land and knew, with quiet certainty, that the sea had never truly agreed to give it up. They were not superstitious people, or rather, they were superstitious in the way that all medieval communities were superstitious, which is to say, they understood the world through the dual lens of God and nature, and they saw no contradiction between the two. Miracles were real, monsters were real. The church kept records of both, and the sea had always produced monsters. Coastal communities across the North Sea had told stories for generations of creatures that lived at the boundary between water and land. Not the romantic mermaids of later imagination, soft and singing on sun-warmed rocks. These were darker figures. The Dutch called her the Merwif, the Sea Woman. She appeared in chronicles and in sermons, and in the warnings mothers gave to children who wandered too close to the water's edge. She was not a fantasy. She was a category, a way of naming the things that came from the deep, that could not be named any other way. In the autumn of 1403, something happened in Edam that no chronicle had prepared them for. A storm came, the dikes broke, the sea swallowed the land whole, and when the waters finally began to recede and the boats went out to search the flooded fields for survivors and salvage, the fishermen of Edam found something in the reeds that they could not explain. They brought it home. What followed would be recorded in chronicles, retold across Europe for centuries, cited by scholars as evidence of sea creatures, and examined by later historians as something far more troubling than a monster story. It is a story about fear, and about what frightened people do with the things they cannot understand. It is a story about a town that looked at something unknown and chose, again and again, the explanation that felt safest, even when safety came at a cost they never fully acknowledged. In 1403, the fishermen of Edam pulled something from the flood waters that they could not explain. What they did with it would say everything about who they were, and very little about what she was. The storm arrived without the usual warnings. Along the Dutch lowlands, in the autumn of 1403, experienced fishermen could read the sky the way other men read scripture, with conviction, with long practice, with the understanding that what was written there mattered more than almost anything else. They knew the particular green that preceded hail. They knew the silence that preceded violence. They knew the way the gulls disappeared hours before a serious storm, retreating inland as if they had received a message that human senses could not detect. But this storm gave no such message, or if it did, it came too late and too quietly to act upon. The North Sea in autumn is not the same body of water that summer visitors admire from harbour walls. It is colder, darker, less predictable, carrying the accumulated energy of Atlantic weather systems that have travelled hundreds of miles before they reach the flat Dutch coast with nothing. No mountains, no hills, no natural barrier of any kind to slow them down. The coastline of the Zuiderzee was, in 1403, a landscape held together by human ingenuity and constant labour. The dikes were not merely infrastructure, they were the difference between farmland and seafloor, between homes and open water, between a life and the end of one. The dikes had been built and rebuilt over generations, each repair the product of collective labour, of entire communities turning out with tools and timber and the particular grim determination of people who understand that the alternative to maintaining the wall is losing everything behind it. Children grew up understanding what the dikes meant. They were taught before they could read that the sea was held back by human will alone, and that human will required constant renewal. There was no point at which the work was finished. There was no season during which the water stopped pressing. When the storm made landfall that October, it did not announce itself gradually. It arrived the way catastrophe always arrives in flat country, from every direction at once, the wind driving rain horizontally across fields that offered no shelter, the Zuiderzee rising in a way that those who witnessed it would later describe not as flooding, but as invasion. The sea did not seep through the dikes. It broke them. It pushed through the weak points that years of maintenance had almost but never entirely resolved. And once the first breach opened, the water that followed understood exactly what to do. By dawn, fields that had been farmland the previous afternoon lay under black water. The villages closest to the dike failures lost everything in hours. Livestock drowned in their pens. The lower floors of farmhouses filled so quickly that families climbed to rooftops still clutching whatever they had grabbed in the dark. Children, bread, tools, a Bible, a coat. Some waited there for days, others did not wait long enough. The historical records from the region document the flood of 1403 as one of the most devastating to strike the Dutch lowlands in a generation, a catastrophe measured not only in property and livestock, but in the particular arithmetic of medieval coastal loss. The fishermen who never came back, the children who simply disappeared into the water, the elderly who were found days later 1/2 mile from where they had last been seen alive. The landscape that emerged after the storm was not the landscape that had existed before it. Fields that families had farmed for 3 generations were gone, swallowed under a grey inland sea that reflected a sky the same colour as itself, the horizon between water and air barely visible. Fence lines ran beneath the surface, their posts marking boundaries that no longer meant anything. The channels that had been dug to drain the land now ran backward, carrying salt water inward instead of fresh water out. The familiar had become unrecognizable. The ground that people had walked their entire lives had become something else entirely, something that would not hold a person's weight, something that offered nothing to stand on. When the storm finally exhausted itself, the boats went out. Not rescue boats, in any organized sense. The men of Edam and the surrounding settlements launched whatever could float, fishing vessels, flat-bottom transport boats, craft that had no business being on open water in the aftermath of a serious storm, but went anyway because there were people somewhere in that flooded landscape who might still be breathing. They moved slowly through what had been, just days before, familiar countryside. They navigated by the tops of fence posts, by the crowns of submerged trees, by the roof lines of farmhouses, now sitting to their gutters in grey water. The search was slow and often silent. Most of what they found was debris. Timber from collapsed outbuildings drifting in slow circles. Thatch. A wooden cart, missing its wheels, turning lazily in a current that had no business existing in a field. The bodies of cattle, bloated and pale, their legs extended stiffly above the waterline. A child's shoe. A shutter. The accumulated wreckage of a landscape that the sea had briefly claimed as its own and had not yet finished cataloguing. The men moved through it without speaking much. There was not a great deal to say. It was in the reeds, the dense stands of marsh grass that had once marked the boundary between a pasture and a drainage channel, and now marked nothing in particular, standing in 2 feet of open water where dry ground had been. That one of the boats slowed. Something was moving. Not the movement of debris caught in a current, not the slow rotation of floating wreckage. Something deliberate. Something that responded to the boat's approach by becoming more still in the particular way that living things become still when they are aware of being observed. The men who noticed it first did not immediately call out to the others. They simply stopped rowing and watched, because the instinct to be quiet in the presence of something unknown is older than language, and operates faster than thought. The men in the boat looked at each other. The logical explanations presented themselves in sequence. A dog, perhaps, or a calf that had found some purchase in the reed bed and was keeping itself above the waterline. A sheep. Animals survive floods by finding high ground that from a distance looked like no ground at all, and the reed beds had likely sheltered more than one creature through the worst of the storm's surge. They brought the boat closer. The movement in the reeds resolved itself slowly, the way shapes always resolve themselves in poor light and uncertain conditions. First as suggestion, then as outline, then as something the eyes could almost but not quite categorize. There was hair, long hair, dark with water, spread across the surface in a shape that did not belong to any animal they knew, not the short wet fur of a dog, or the matted fleece of a drowned sheep. Hair, long and tangled and threaded through with river grass and debris, fanning out across the waterlogged surface of the reed bed in a way that framed what lay beneath it. There were hands, pale, gripping the reed stalks with a tension that suggested not accident but intention, not the clinging of something helpless, but the concealment of something aware. The knuckles were white against the dark green of the reeds. The grip was deliberate. Whatever was in the water was holding itself in place, pressing itself down into the cover of the marsh grass, trying to remain unseen. And then there were eyes, open, dark, watching the boat with an expression that the men who were there would later struggle to describe, not because it was inhuman, which would have been easier, not because it was entirely alien, which would have been manageable, but because it was not entirely inhuman, either. And the uncertainty was worse than either alternative would have been. There was awareness in those eyes. There was recognition. Whatever was in the reeds understood that it was being looked at and was looking back with the same evaluating attention that the men were directing toward it. The lower half of her body was beneath the water, obscured by the murk that the storm had stirred up from the channel bottom. Her upper half, the shoulders, the long neck, the face, were above the waterline, and what the men saw there was close enough to human that none of them moved for a long moment, close enough to make simple categorization impossible, close enough that the question of what to do about her was not the first question that arose. The first question was something older and harder to articulate. The question of what exactly they were looking at. Then she moved, not toward them, away. A sudden violent thrashing in the reeds, the hair flying, the hands releasing, their grip and churning the water. A sound coming from her that one account would later describe as neither screaming nor growling, but something that existed in the space between those two things. Something that the men felt in their chests before they processed it with their ears. It was the sound of something that did not want to be caught. That much at least was unmistakable. She was fast, faster than they expected, moving through the flooded reed bed with a confidence that suggested she knew this element. That water was not a medium she was trapped in, but one she understood in ways they did not. For a moment it seemed she might simply vanish back into the grey of the flooded field, become suggestion again, become something they might have imagined in the strange light of a post-storm morning. But the reed bed had an end, and beyond it was open water, and the boat was between her and the open water, and the men, without quite deciding to, without a spoken plan, had spread out to either side. She fought when they reached her. Whatever she was not weak, The men who pulled her from the water that morning were fishermen, accustomed to hauling nets and managing boats in heavy weather, not small or tentative in the way they used their bodies. She fought them anyway. She twisted and clawed and made that sound again. The one that sat between categories, that belonged to no creature they could name, and 2 of the men bore marks on their arms for weeks afterward. They bound her with rope from the boat, not gently, but not with deliberate cruelty, with the grim efficiency of people managing a situation that had no precedent and required immediate practical resolution. She did not stop fighting, but she stopped being able to act on it. The boat turned back toward Edam. The water stretched flat and grey in every direction, the drowned landscape silent around them, the sky the colour of old pewter. In the hull of the boat, wrapped in rope and dripping with sweet sea water, something that was not quite a fish and not quite a woman lay still for the first time and stared upward at a sky she had perhaps never seen from this angle before. She did not speak. She did not weep. She made no sound at all now. She simply watched the clouds move overhead with the same dark, evaluating attention she had directed at the men in the reeds, as if she were memorizing the route back, as if she were noting carefully and without panic exactly where the water was and exactly how far she was being taken from it. Whatever they had dragged from the flood, it was alive. Edam was not a large town, but it was a connected one. It sat at the edge of the Zuiderzee, in the way that all successful medieval trading settlements sat at the edge of water, with 1 foot in the commercial world of boats and tides and market days, and 1 foot in the older, quieter world of farming communities and church bells and the slow rhythms of agricultural life. It was a town that knew its neighbours, that traded with the larger cities of the region, that received travellers and merchants and the occasional pilgrim passing through on their way to somewhere more significant. News travelled quickly in a place like Edam, not because anyone organised its transmission, but because the community was small enough that information moved through it the way water moves through cloth. Not by any single channel, but everywhere at once, soaking through the fabric of daily life, until there was no part of it that remained dry. By the time the boat carrying her reached the dock, people were already watching. Word had moved ahead of the vessel through some mechanism that no one later thought to document. A shout from the waterline, a boy who had seen the boat returning and run to tell his mother, a fisherman who had been out in his own craft and come back early with the news that something had been found in the reeds beyond the flooded pastures. Whatever the mechanism, the result was the same. There were people on the dock when the boat arrived, and there were more people by the time the men climbed out, and there were more still by the time they had carried her, bound, dripping, making no sound now, up from the waterline and into the town. The crowd that gathered did not surge forward. It held back, which said something about the quality of the thing being carried. Crowds held back when what they were looking at produced a feeling they could not immediately name. What the people of Edam saw in those first moments was not by any account immediately clear. She was covered in mud and river grass, her hair so thickly tangled with reeds and debris that the shape of her head was obscured beneath it. Her skin, where it was visible beneath the mud, was pale in the particular way of someone who had spent a long time in cold water. Not the paleness of illness exactly, not the grey of fever or the white of shock, but something more absolute, something that looked less like colour and more like the absence of it, as if the cold of the Zuiderzee had drawn something fundamental out of her and not returned it. Her clothing, if she had ever worn any, was gone or so thoroughly destroyed by water and time that nothing remained to suggest what it might once have been. She was, in those first moments, simply a shape, human in outline, uncertain in detail, familiar enough to stop the crowd from retreating and strange enough to stop them from approaching. The men who had brought her from the reeds did not linger to answer questions. They were wet and tired and shaken in the particular way of people who have done something that felt necessary in the moment and unsettling in retrospect. They answered what they could, briefly, and left others to manage what came next. They put her in a barn on the edge of the town. It was a practical choice made quickly by practical people. She needed to be somewhere enclosed, somewhere she could be kept without escaping, somewhere that could be secured against both her departure and the curiosity of the town's less restrained members. A barn was not a prison, but it was solid and lockable and crucially available. The decision was not discussed at length. Someone suggested it, someone agreed, and the matter was settled with the decisiveness of people managing an immediate problem without the luxury of time to consider long-term implications. The deeper questions, what she was, what they owed her, what they intended to do with her, would have to wait. First she needed to be somewhere. The barns was somewhere. She did not go quietly. The binding had calmed her on the boat, in the way that restraint calms some creatures, not by removing the will to fight, but by removing the ability to act on it. Once inside the barn, with walls on all sides, and the smell of hay and old timber replacing the smell of open water, something shifted. She became frantic in a way she had not been on the boat. She moved against the ropes, with a focused, systematic effort that suggested she was not panicking but problem-solving, testing each point of restraint with deliberate attention, working through the constraints the way a craftsman works through a problem, methodically, without wasted motion, with the patience of something that understands that persistence matters more than force. She looked for weakness in the system the way water looks for weakness in a dike, pressing here, pressing there, never giving up entirely, never accepting that there was no way through. She found none, but she kept looking. Over the following days, the town attempted to manage her existence in the way that medieval communities managed all unprecedented situations, through a combination of practical improvisation and careful observation. She was given food, bread first, then fish, then other things that the people of Edam imagined might be acceptable to something that had come from the water. She refused it all, not dramatically, not with the violence that characterized her attempts to escape, but with a consistency that was, in its own way, more unnerving than aggression would have been. She simply did not eat what was placed before her, turning her face away with a steadiness that suggested not hunger strike, but genuine incompatibility, as if the food itself were wrong in some fundamental way that had nothing to do with willingness, as if her body knew things about what it required that the people of Edam could not guess at and she could not communicate. She drank water, that much the town, established early and with some relief. Whatever she was, she needed water as surely as any living thing, and she would accept it when it was offered, wrapping both hands around the vessel and drinking with an attention that suggested she understood its importance in a way that went beyond simple thirst. She watched the person who offered it to her with that same dark, evaluating attention that the men in the boat had first encountered in the rides, measuring, categorizing, filing the information away for purposes that remained her own. She tried to escape constantly, not randomly, not in all directions with equal desperation, but always toward the water, always in the same direction, with the same unwavering orientation that suggested not panic, but navigation. The barn's eastern wall faced toward the Zuiderzee, and she pressed against it with a persistence that seemed to operate independently of fatigue or discouragement. When one attempt was stopped, she waited. When waiting was finished, she tried again, slightly differently, as if she had analyzed what had failed the previous time and adjusted her approach. The men who were assigned to watch her quickly learned to read her rhythms. She became quieter when the tide was low, retreating into herself in a way that looked almost like rest. She grew more agitated as the tide rose, restless first, then focused, then pressing against whatever stood between her and the water, with the steady, purposeful tension of something following a signal too deep to ignore. During storms, she was barely manageable. During calm weather, she was simply relentless. This was the detail that disturbed the people of Edam most deeply, more than anything else about her. More than her appearance, more than her silence, more than the sound she made in moments of distress. Not the strangeness of her form, which could be explained as the product of long time in water, of exposure and privation, of whatever existence she had been, living before the flood brought her into human territory. Not her refusal to eat what they offered, which could be attributed to the shock of captivity, or the particular needs of a creature whose diet was simply different from theirs, but the orientation, the absolute unwavering pull toward the sea, the way she tracked it, the way a compass tracks north, the way she pressed against whatever stood between her and it with the focused attention of something following a call that had not stopped simply because the walls of a barn now stood in its way. It raised questions that no one was quite ready to ask aloud. If she simply wanted to escape, if her drive were toward freedom in the general sense, toward open space and the absence of walls, she would press against all the walls equally. She did not. She pressed against the eastern wall, the one that faced the water. She was not trying to escape. She was trying to return, and the distinction for the people watching her was not a comfortable one. The watching spread beyond the barn. Edam was a curious town, and a connected one, and word of what had been found in the flood waters spread with a speed that the geography of the region naturally encouraged. Traders mentioned it in the next town. Fishermen discussed it at market. A merchant who passed through Edam on his way south carried the story with him and deposited it in the next place he stopped, slightly enlarged, slightly altered in the way that all stories are altered in transmission. The creature a little stranger in each retelling, the circumstances of the capture a little more dramatic, the details a little more vivid than the men who had actually been in the boat might have recognized, but recognizable in its essential outline. Something had been found in the flood waters, something that was not quite an animal and not quite a woman, something alive and strange, and currently residing in a barn in Edam. People came to look. They were not, for the most part, making special journeys. They were people who had reason to pass through Edam anyway, traders, travelers, the inhabitants of neighboring settlements, who came to town for market day and found as a secondary attraction the thing in the barn on the eastern edge. The town's response to this attention was complicated and not entirely unified. There was pride in it, the particular pride of a small community that has suddenly found itself the subject of wider interest, that has something others want to see. There was also unease. The visitors asked questions that the people of Edam had not yet answered for themselves. And being asked questions you cannot answer about something you are responsible for produces a specific kind of discomfort. What was it? Where had it come from? What did they intend to do with it? These were reasonable questions to which no one had reasonable answers. The debate that moved through Edam in the weeks following her capture was not organized or formal. It happened in the way that community debates always happened, in doorways, at market stalls, after church on Sunday mornings, when people lingered in the square rather than returning immediately to their homes. It happened in fragments, incomplete, interrupted by children and weather and the ordinary demands of daily life. But it was persistent, and it circled around the same questions, with the same inability to resolve them. Was she a demon? Something sent by the storm as punishment, as warning, as the visible embodiment of God's displeasure with a community that had perhaps been insufficiently devout, insufficiently careful, insufficiently grateful for the land it had been given. This explanation had the advantage of existing within a framework the town already possessed. Demons were real. The church said so. If she was demonic, then the appropriate response was clear, even if it wasn't pleasant. Was she a sea spirit? The merwif of coastal legend, the figure that appeared at the boundary between water and land, that sailors glimpsed, and fishermen feared, and mothers invoked, when they wanted their children to stay away from the shoreline after dark. This explanation also had the advantage of existing within a known tradition, though it raised its own uncomfortable questions about what one did with a spirit one had accidentally captured and was now responsible for feeding. Was she a natural creature? Medieval natural philosophy accepted without significant controversy that the sea contained beings of extraordinary and varied form. The ocean was vast and largely unexplored, and what emerged from it, occasionally, was not always explicable in terms of known categories. Scholars wrote seriously about sea creatures of humanoid form. Sailors reported encountering them. If she was simply a rare animal, an unusual creature thrown up by an unusual storm, then her presence in Edam was a curiosity rather than a crisis, remarkable but ultimately manageable. Or was she something else entirely? A human woman, mad or mute, or simply foreign, surviving in ways that her captors could not understand, and expressing her distress in ways they could not interpret. This possibility was the one that circulated least openly, because it was the one with the most uncomfortable implications. If she was a woman, then what had been done to her was not the management of a creature. It was the imprisonment of a person. No one resolved the debate. The debate simply continued underground, surfacing occasionally in the glances exchanged when she did something unexpected, in the silences that followed certain observations about her behavior, in the care with which people chose their words when discussing her in mixed company. At some point, the accounts do not agree on exactly when, the decision was made to wash her, to remove the mud and the river grass and the accumulated evidence of whatever life she had been living before the flood, and to dress her in clean linen, and to present her in a form that was less immediately disturbing to the visitors who came to observe her. This was described, in the language of the time, as a charitable act, as the town extending its basic Christian obligation of decency to something that had been brought, however involuntarily, under its care and responsibility. What it was, as well, was an act of transformation. The creature that had come out of the reeds, that dark, reed-tangled, mud-covered, violent shape that the boatman had bound and carried home, became, through washing and clothing, and the patient imposition of human presentation, something closer to what the town could recognize. The linen covered the strangeness of her form. The cleaned hair, combed and dried, fell in a way that was simply long rather than wild. The mud removed, her face was visible in its entirety for the first time, and it was a face that people found they could look at longer than they had expected. She sat in the clean linen with the patience of something waiting for an opportunity, rather than the contentment of something at ease. She watched the people who came to look at her with the same unbroken attention she had directed at the sky from the bottom of the boat. She did not perform for her visitors. She did not react to their presence in the ways they seemed to expect. She did not cower, did not rage, did not display herself. She simply watched them watching her, and waited, and breathed the air of a barn on the eastern edge of Edam with the steady, quiet concentration of something that had not yet given up. And always, regardless of what was happening around her, regardless of who was in the barn or what they were saying or how long they stayed, her attention returned, again and again, to the eastern wall. She never stopped looking toward the sea. The church could not stay silent forever. In 1403, The church was not one institution among many. It was the framework through which all of reality was understood, the lens that organized what people saw, the language in which they described what they experienced, the authority that determined what things meant and what should be done about them. When something unprecedented happened in a medieval community, the community did not turn to philosophers or scientists or government officials. It turned to the church, and the church, presented with something it had no existing category for, did what institutions always do when confronted with the genuinely new. It reached for the closest existing framework and attempted to apply it. The question the church brought to the barn on the eastern edge of Edam was not a simple one. It was, in fact, one of the most consequential questions that medieval theology could ask about a living being. Did she have a soul? The question sounds abstract. It was not. In the theological framework of 15th century Europe, the soul was not a metaphysical nicety or a poetic metaphor. It was the determining fact of a creature's moral status, the line that separated beings who existed within God's order, and therefore within the church's responsibility, from beings that existed outside it. Animals did not have rational souls. They could be used, killed, owned, and consumed without moral consequence beyond the practical. Humans had rational souls, which meant they existed within a web of obligations owed to them by others, and obligations they owed in return. To imprison an animal was management. To imprison a person was a sin. The stakes of the question, in other words, were not abstract at all. If she was a creature, soulless animal in nature, despite her approximate human shape, then what Edam had done by capturing her was unremarkable, no different in moral weight from penning a strange dog, found wandering after a flood. The town could keep her, display her, study her, dispose of her as circumstance required, without any obligation beyond the practical management of an unusual animal. But if she had a soul, if she existed within God's order as a rational being, however strange her form, then the barn, the ropes, the confinement, the visitors paying to look at her, all of it became something else entirely, something the church would have a great deal to say about. The clergy of Edam approached the problem with the seriousness it deserved. A series of tests were devised, drawn from theological tradition and practical observation, designed to answer the question that observation alone had failed to resolve. These were not scientific tests in any modern sense. They were not designed to probe her biology or her cognition in systematic ways. They were designed to probe her relationship to the divine order, to determine whether the marks of rational, God-given intelligence were present in her or absent, whether she responded to the sacred in ways that only a being with a soul could respond. The first test was simple. Did she react to the ringing of church bells? Church bells in medieval Europe were not merely signals for the time of day. They were understood to have sacred significance, to mark the presence of God's order in the daily life of the community, to call the faithful and, in some traditions, to repel the demonic. A creature of evil nature was believed to respond to church bells with distress or aggression. A rational human soul would respond with attention, with the instinctive recognition of something meaningful. She responded to the bells. She went still when they rang, in the way that she went still when the men in the reeds had first approached her, with the concentrated attention of something that was listening carefully. Whether this meant what the clergy hoped it meant was impossible to determine. She went still, for other sounds too, for the wind changing direction, for the movement of water in the distance. Her stillness was not obviously sacred in nature, but it was not obviously demonic either. The second test concerned Latin. Speech was, in medieval theological understanding, the outward mark of the rational soul. The capacity for language, for abstract thought expressed in communicable form, was what distinguished human beings from animals, what reflected the divine intelligence in which, according to scripture, humanity had been made. If she could understand speech, even without producing it, this would suggest the presence of rational capacity. Clergy spoke to her in Latin, in the formal language of the church, reading scripture and prayer in the tones used during Mass. She did not respond in any way that could be clearly interpreted as comprehension, but she listened. She tracked the speaker with her eyes. She maintained the focused, evaluating attention that had characterized every interaction with her from the beginning. Whether this was comprehension or simply the alertness of a captive creature monitoring the humans around it for signs of threat or opportunity, this too could not be determined. The third test was the sign of the cross. Someone made the gesture before her slowly, deliberately, in a way that gave her every opportunity to observe, and if she were capable of it, to imitate. She watched. She did not immediately respond. But over the following days, something began to happen that would unsettle the clergy more than any of the negative results had done. She began to imitate. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, observationally, in the way that a creature of high intelligence absorbs what it repeatedly witnesses and eventually begins to reproduce. She started to mirror what she saw. The sign of the cross appeared first as a vague gesture, imprecise in its execution but recognizable in its general shape. It became more accurate over time. She was not mimicking randomly. She was watching specific people make specific gestures and reproducing them with improving precision, as if she were practicing in the intervals between observation. Then she learned to spin thread. This was the detail that the Chronicle specifically preserved, the one that traveled with the story as it spread across Europe, the one that people found most striking and most difficult to dismiss. Someone, the accounts differ, on whether this was a deliberate choice or simply the result of a woman sitting near her captive space and working at her usual tasks, introduced a spindle into her environment. She watched the spinning for some time. Then she took the spindle and, slowly, imperfectly at first, and with increasing competence over the following weeks, she learned to use it. Spinning thread was not an instinctive behavior. It was not something a creature of pure animal nature could acquire through observation. It required the capacity to watch, to abstract the principle of what was being done from the specific actions of a specific person, and to apply that principle to one's own hands in a new context. It required, in other words, a form of intelligence that the theology of the time associated unambiguously with rational capacity. The town was profoundly unsettled. The clergy were unsettled in one direction. If she could learn, if she could imitate sacred gesture, if she could acquire a skilled human craft through observation, then the question of her soul was no longer a question that could be comfortably dismissed. It demanded an answer. And the answer it seemed to be pointing toward was the one with the most uncomfortable implications. The ordinary people of Edam were unsettled in a different direction. They had been managing her for weeks now as a thing, a remarkable thing, a strange thing, a thing worth seeing and discussing and debating, but fundamentally a thing rather than a person. The spindle changed that in a way that was difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. A creature that could learn a skill was a creature that was, in some sense, developing, growing, becoming more capable over time. That was not how things behaved. That was how people behaved. She sat in church. This was tried. Eventually, she was brought to the church in the company of guards, and she sat through the service with the patient, watchful stillness that characterized everything she did. She did not flee. She did not show signs of the distress that demonic nature was expected to produce in sacred space. She watched the ceremony with the same focused attention she brought to everything, and when others kneeled, she kneeled, imprecisely but recognizably, in the way of someone who has seen kneeling many times and has decided to reproduce it. After the service, the priest was quiet for a long time. The more she learned, the more the town's situation clarified into something nobody had wanted to confront directly. They had assumed that the question of her nature would resolve itself, that she would either reveal herself as clearly animal or clearly human, that time and observation would produce the answer that would tell them what to do. Instead, time and observation had produced only more ambiguity, more evidence on both sides, more reasons to keep debating, and fewer reasons to feel confident in any particular conclusion. And beneath the theology, beneath the tests and the results and the careful clerical deliberation, a simpler and more human discomfort had begun to settle over Edam. She had learned the sign of the cross. She had learned to spin. She had sat in church without distress. She had watched and absorbed and improved, week by week, with the quiet determination of something that was paying very close attention to the world it found itself in. If she had a soul, then what exactly were they? The floodwaters receded slowly, the way they always did. There was no single morning when the land returned. It happened in stages, over weeks, the water pulling back from the highest ground first, leaving behind a crust of salt and silt and debris that marked the reach of the flood the way a tide mark stains a harbour wall. Fields that had been underwater emerged grey and damaged, their topsoil displaced, their drainage channels choked with the sediment the storm had carried inland. The work of recovery was immense and immediate. Dikes needed repairing, land needed clearing, animals needed replacing. The practical demands of survival in a community that depended on the productivity of its surrounding fields did not pause to allow for extended reflection on the philosophical implications of the creature in the barn. Life, in other words, attempted to return to normal, and for a time, a brief time, it almost succeeded. The market days resumed, the fishing boats went out again, on the Zuiderzee, cautiously at first, then with the confidence that comes from necessity, reasserting itself over fear. Children returned to their routines. The church held its regular services, and the people of Edam filled the pews with the particular gratitude of a community that has survived something it was not certain it would survive, offering thanks with the sincerity of people who understand that the alternative was real and recent and closer than comfort allowed. She remained in the barn. The Tess had not resolved her status. The debate had not produced a conclusion. The church had not issued a ruling, and so she remained where she was, watched by rotating guards, fed water that she accepted and food that she mostly refused, learning her spindle in the particular silence that had come to characterize her existence in captivity. The visitors still came, though perhaps with less frequency than in the first weeks. The novelty of her presence had not entirely faded, but it had settled into something more routine. She was a feature of Edam now, strange and unresolved, present in the way that unresolved things are present, occupying space in the community's attention without ever quite releasing it. Then a fisherman drowned. He was not an old man or an inexperienced one. He had fished the Zuiderzee for more than 20 years, knew its moods and its currents with the intimacy of long acquaintance, had survived storms that had taken younger and less cautious men. He went out on a morning of calm water under a clear sky and did not come back. His boat was found drifting near the northern shore 2 days later, undamaged, his net still in it, partially deployed as if he had been in the middle of ordinary work when something had interrupted it. There was no storm. There was no obvious explanation. The sea had simply taken him, as the sea occasionally took people without announcement or apology or discernible reason. In any other year, his death would have been mourned and then absorbed into the community's understanding of what life on the water cost. Drowning was not rare. It was not even unusual. Every family in Edam had lost someone to the Zuiderzee at some point. A father, a brother, a cousin, a neighbor whose empty chair at the table became simply part of the furniture of grief that coastal communities carried, as a matter of course. The sea gave, and the sea took, and the taking was part of the bargain that everyone who lived beside it had implicitly agreed to, simply by remaining. But this was not another year. A child went missing 3 weeks later, a girl of perhaps 7 or 8 years, the daughter of a family that lived near the eastern edge of town, not far from the marsh that bordered the flooded area, where recovery work was still ongoing. She was there in the morning and gone by afternoon, and the search that the community mounted found no trace of her. Not at the marsh's edge, not in the drainage channels, not in the shallow water that still lingered in the lowest lying fields. She was simply absent, in the way that the fishermen had been simply absent, without explanation or evidence, leaving behind only the fact of her disappearance and the space where she had been, a space that the people who loved her could not stop measuring with their eyes. Then livestock, 3 cattle found dead on the shoreline on a morning when the water had been calm and the night had been quiet, found positioned in a way that suggested they had walked into the water rather than fallen, their bodies arranged by the tide into a configuration that the farmer who discovered them would describe, in terms that would be repeated throughout the town for weeks afterward, as deliberate, as if something had placed them there, as if something had chosen them. Separately, each of these events was tragedy of a kind that coastal life produced with grim regularity. A drowned fisherman, a missing child, dead livestock near the water. None of these things were without precedent. None of them, taken alone, would have produced anything beyond the ordinary mourning and practical response that such losses always generated. But they did not happen in another year. They happened in this one, the year the flood came, the year she came with it. The mechanism by which a community moves from grief to suspicion is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It operates quietly, in the spaces between stated thoughts, in the pauses in conversation, in the particular way that people's eyes moved when certain subjects were raised in certain company. No one stood in the market square and made the accusation openly. No one needed to. The connection formed itself in the collective mind of the town, with the organic efficiency of a conclusion that everyone is approaching from different directions simultaneously. A conclusion that no one needs to state, because by the time it is fully formed, everyone already knows it. And the act of stating it would only make visible how long they have all been thinking it in private. She had arrived with the flood. The fisherman had drowned after her arrival. The child had disappeared after her arrival. The cattle had died after her arrival. The sequence was not proof of anything. Sequence is never proof of anything. But sequence, for a frightened community searching for pattern in a series of losses that felt too concentrated to be entirely random, carries a weight that logic alone cannot easily displace. Human minds are pattern-seeking by nature. The same capacity that allows a fisherman to read approaching weather in the color of the sky also allows a community to read a series of events for meaning, to construct narrative from coincidence, to find cause where perhaps only proximity exists. It is not a failure of intelligence. It is intelligence operating exactly as it was designed to operate, in conditions where the available information is incomplete and the cost of inaction feels higher than the cost of a wrong conclusion. The whispers began in the way that whispers always begin, quietly, tentatively, framed as questions rather than accusations, offered in the tone of someone merely thinking aloud, rather than someone asserting anything. Had anyone noticed that she became agitated before the storm that preceded the fisherman's death? Not the storm of 1403. A smaller storm, weeks later, the kind of rougher weather that the Zuiderzee produced regularly in the autumn months. She had been restless the day before it arrived. The guards had noted it. Had the fisherman gone out the following morning despite the weather, because the morning itself had seemed calm, the storm not yet visible to ordinary human perception, but perhaps visible to her? Had anyone been watching when the child went missing? She had been pressing against the eastern wall that afternoon with more than her usual persistence. One of the guards mentioned this to another. The other mentioned it to his wife. His wife mentioned it to her neighbor. By the time the observation had traveled through 3 or 4 conversations, it had acquired a weight it had not originally carried, had become, in the retelling, more significant, more purposeful, more like evidence of something and less like the ordinary restlessness of a captive creature on a tide-rising afternoon. No one claimed to have seen her do anything. This was important, and some of the town's more careful thinkers noted it explicitly in the conversations they had with each other. There was no evidence, no witness, no moment at which anyone could point and say with confidence that she had caused what had been lost. She had been in the barn when the fisherman drowned. She had been confined and watched when the child disappeared. The cattle had died on a shoreline she could not reach. Whatever the whispers implied, the documented facts did not support the conclusion they were quietly building toward. But fear does not require facts. It requires only the feeling that facts are insufficient, that the visible, documented, verifiable surface of events does not capture what is actually happening beneath it. And that feeling, once established in a community, is remarkably resistant to evidence. You cannot disprove a suspicion with the absence of proof, because the absence of proof can always be reinterpreted as the cleverness of the thing you suspect. A creature intelligent enough to cause harm without being seen is, by definition, a creature whose innocence cannot be demonstrated by the absence of witnesses. The town's behavior shifted in ways that were small individually and significant in their accumulation. Children who had been brought to the barn to observe her, cautiously, in supervised groups, as a kind of controlled encounter with the remarkable, were no longer brought. Mothers who had allowed their older children to accompany visiting adults to see the extraordinary creature from the flood now answered the same requests with a firmness that did not invite further discussion. The guards assigned to watch her were increased, not because she had become more dangerous in any documented sense, but because the feeling that she required more watching had become too widespread to ignore without appearing negligent. The clergy who had visited regularly to continue their theological assessment came less frequently. When they came, they stayed for shorter periods. When they left, they seemed less inclined to discuss what they had observed, as if the question of her soul had become less urgent than the question of her nature. And her nature, in the community's shifting perception, was resolving itself in a direction that made theological nuance feel beside the point. She was watched differently now. The curiosity that had characterized Edam's attention in the first weeks, genuine, uncomfortable, fascinated, the open engagement of people encountering something genuinely unprecedented, had begun to harden into something with a different quality. The visitors who still came looked at her, not with wonder, but with the narrowed attention of people looking for confirmation of something they had already decided. They watched for signs of the thing they feared, and because fear is an extraordinarily effective filter for perception, they found them in the restlessness of her movements, in the sound she made when the tide was high, in the way her attention oriented always and without exception toward the water, toward the sea, as if she were in communication with something out there that the people of Edam could not access. She had come to Edam as a wonder. She was becoming something else. Through all of it, through the whispers and the withdrawn children and the increased guards and the changed quality of every gaze that settled on her, she sat in the barn on the eastern edge of Edam and did what she had always done. She watched the wall that faced the water. She pressed against it when the tide rose. She went still when the bells rang, and restless when the wind shifted, and quiet in the particular way of something that hasn't given up, but has learned to be patient about it. She did not know what she had become to them. The sea had always taken lives. Now it had a face. The deaths were never solved. Not because the people of Edam lacked the will to solve them, but because there was nothing to solve. The fishermen had drowned in the way that fishermen drowned, through some combination of current and misfortune and the sea's fundamental indifference to human survival. The child, in all likelihood, had wandered into the marsh during the confused weeks of flood recovery, when the boundaries between safe ground and dangerous ground were not yet re-established, when the landscape itself had not yet decided what it was going to be. The cattle had died the way cattle sometimes died near water, for reasons that had everything to do with the ordinary hazards of livestock management in a coastal environment, and nothing to do with anything that could be named or confined or punished. The sea did what the sea always did. It took without explanation and without malice, because taking was simply what it was. But Edam could not punish the sea. This was the core of what happened in the years that followed her capture. The quiet truth beneath the whispers and the changed behavior and the hardening of the town's perception of what she was and what she meant. The sea was too vast, too ancient, too indifferent to be held responsible in any way that provided relief. You could not stand before the Zuiderzee and demand accounting for what it had taken. You could not confine it, try it, reduce it to something manageable. It would go on doing what it did regardless of how much it had cost you, regardless of how much you needed it to stop. But she was there. She was confined and watchable and present in a way that the sea was not. She had come from the water. She oriented toward it always, without exception, with a consistency that looked, if you needed it to look like this, like loyalty, like connection, like the visible end of an invisible thread that ran from the barn on the eastern edge of Edam, all the way out into the grey depths of the Zuiderzee, binding her to whatever lived out there, making her the sea's representative in a world that desperately needed the sea to have a representative it could deal with. She became, quietly and without ceremony, the explanation. Her conditions changed in ways that were gradual enough to seem almost unintentional, the product of accumulated small decisions, rather than any single deliberate choice. She was confined more strictly. The area in which she could move was reduced, the ropes used more frequently. The freedom of the space she occupied contracted to something smaller than it had been. She was fed less reliably, not through deliberate starvation, but through the diminished attention of a community that had moved from fascination to wariness, that thought about her less as a wonder to be maintained and more as a problem to be managed at minimum cost. She was seen by fewer people. The visitors, who had come from neighbouring settlements in the first weeks, came less frequently, and the people of Edam themselves, who had once gathered to observe and debate and attempt to understand, now largely stayed away. She became, in the language of the town's daily life, something that was simply there, present and unresolved, and quietly costly, the way all unresolved things are costly, not dramatically, not in ways that demanded immediate attention, but steadily, in the background, draining something from the community's sense of itself that it could not easily name. She was still learning. Through all of this, still watching, still absorbing what she could observe of the world she found herself in. The spindle still moved in her hands, the thread she produced growing more even with practice, the skill settling into her fingers with the patience of someone who has very little else to do, and a great deal of time in which to do it. This detail, which had once seemed remarkable, evidence of rational capacity, of intelligence worth taking seriously, attracted less attention now. The town had largely stopped updating its assessment of her. The conclusion it had reached, or rather the conclusion it had drifted toward without formally reaching, was sufficient for the purposes it was serving, and new evidence that complicated it was simply not incorporated. Then came the second storm. Not a flood storm. Nothing approaching the scale of 1403. A serious autumn storm, the kind the Zuiderzee produced regularly, with heavy rain and winds that drove whitecaps across the inland sea and kept the fishing boats in harbour. The kind of storm that Edam had weathered dozens of times without incident, that the dikes were built to manage, that the community knew how to wait out. She knew it was coming before anyone else did. The guards noted it afterward, comparing observations in the way that people compare observations after something significant has happened, assembling a sequence of events that felt more meaningful in retrospect than any single element had felt in the moment. She had begun to change hours before the wind picked up, growing more agitated as the afternoon progressed, pressing against the eastern wall with a focused intensity that exceeded even her usual persistence. By evening she was frantic, clawing at the door, making the sound that the boatman had first heard in the reeds, that category-defying sound that lived in the space between screaming and something more animal. And the sound was louder now than it had ever been inside the confined space of the barn, loud enough that the nearest houses could hear it through their shuttered windows, loud enough that people who were already anxious about the approaching weather lay awake listening to it, and found that it made the anxiety worse. The storm arrived at midnight. It was difficult and damaging, but not catastrophic. The dikes held. No one drowned. By dawn, it had passed, and the town began the familiar work of assessing and repairing. But the night had confirmed something for the people of Edam that they had not previously been willing to state quite so directly. She had known. She had called it. Whether she was afraid of storms, whether what they had witnessed was terror, rather than summons. A creature who had survived one catastrophic flood, pressing in desperate panic against the walls of her confinement, because she could feel the water rising, and the storm coming, and every instinct she possessed was screaming at her to get to open water before she was trapped again. This question was not asked, or rather, it was asked by perhaps one or two people, quietly, in private, and the asking produced no response that changed anything, because by this point the narrative had its own momentum, and individual doubt was insufficient to alter its direction. She was calling the storms. She was the sea's instrument. She was what she had always been, from the moment they pulled her from the reeds. A creature of the water, belonging to the water, carrying the water's ancient indifference to human life, inside whatever passed for a heart in something like her. The years that followed are the part of the story that the chronicles preserve least clearly. The accounts agree that she lived in Edam for some number of years. Estimates range from a few to perhaps 15 or more, the sources disagreeing in ways that cannot now be reconciled. They agree that she never spoke, that she never stopped orienting toward the sea, that she continued learning, in her patient and observational way, the skills and gestures and routines of the human world she was confined within, without ever quite becoming legible to that world in the way that would have made her safe. They agree that she died in captivity. The cause is not recorded. The chronicles do not dwell on it. She was there, and then she was not there, and the fact of her absence is noted with less ceremony than her arrival had been. A single line in one account, a brief reference in another, the kind of documentation that a community produces for something it has long since processed and filed away. She had been a problem, and now the problem was resolved, and the resolution did not require extensive commemoration. But then came the detail that no one who has studied this story has ever quite been able to explain away. She was buried in consecrated ground, after years of debate about whether she had a soul, after the church's tests had produced no definitive answer, after the town had spent the better part of her captivity treating her as something between an animal and a demon, as the sea's instrument and the community's convenient explanation for its losses. After all of this, when she died, someone made the decision to bury her as a Christian, in the churchyard, in the ground reserved for those who existed within God's order and deserved the church's final acknowledgement of their humanity. No document explains this decision. No record names who made it or what reasoning was offered. It simply happened, and the fact of it sits at the end of her story, like a question that the town asked too late. If she was a monster, they had treated her as a prisoner. If she was human, they had treated her as a monster. And in the end, standing over a grave in consecrated ground, they had arrived at a conclusion about her nature that their behavior over the preceding years had made impossible to act on with any integrity. The storm of 1403 broke the dikes. It reshaped the coastline. It drowned livestock and displaced families and left behind a landscape that would take years to fully recover. But it also broke something else, something less visible and more lasting than any dike. The line between fear and cruelty is not always obvious when you are standing on it. It rarely announces itself. It is crossed in small steps, through accumulated small decisions, through the quiet convenience of an explanation that asks nothing of the person who accepts it, except that they stop asking harder questions. Was she ever a monster? Or did a frightened town simply need one? The town of Edam still exists. The dikes still hold the water back. The Zuid de Zee is gone now, drained in the 20th century, turned into farmland by the same patient. Determined engineering that has always defined this part of the world. The sea that took the fishermen, that swallowed the fields, that carried her to the reeds where the boatman found her. That particular water no longer exists in the form it took in 1403, but the questions it left behind have not been drained away so easily. Whatever she was, she is part of the water now. Whatever she knew, the weight of the current, the smell of open sea, the particular freedom of a world without walls. It was hers, and no bond, no rope, no community sphere ever fully reached it. The sea keeps no records. It does not remember the names of what it has taken or what it has given. It simply continues, patient, indifferent, older than any story told about it. If tonight you find yourself drifting towards sleep, let the water settle around you. Let the questions rest where they lie. And if you dream of grey water and open reeds, perhaps now you will wonder what was watching from the shallows, not with fear, with something gentler than that.